All right. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so my biggest piece of advice when it comes to the MCAT, pretty much in every section, is read the question word by word to yourself. So one thing that I used to do a lot is you just kind of, because when you're reading like a book, for example, you're not going to read every single word. You're gonna notice a few words in a particular order, and then you're gonna infer the meaning, and that way you can read at a reasonable pace and not take forever. But when you're looking at questions, you really do want to read the questions one word at a time. Because if you skip something, you might miss a not, or an also, or an except, or most, or least, and so that's going to be a potential pitfall for you, even if you know how to do the problem. Also, if you only read some of the words and not all of them, you might invent an entirely new question that doesn't actually exist and then answer that. And that might waste you time. That might lead you down the wrong path. You get the idea. So when you see a question, you should read it to yourself one word at a time, as in like the NAD plus NADH ratio is a component of the redox state of a cell. How would an increase in pyruvate concentration change this value? You should be reading that to yourself in your brain voice. And then you should take a second and read it one more time. And you might notice something new if you want to read it a second time. This shouldn't add a ton of time to your actual to the time you spend on this question. It's just a few seconds that can have a huge benefit and save you a lot of dumb mistakes. So I also wanted to highlight this question, which comes from Khan Academy, by the way, because of the answers. So notice that the answers are, and this is going to be something that is key for all the sections, that there's three different components to the answers. There's you're either increasing or decreasing the ratio. There's an increase in pyruvate, and then there is an increase or decrease in NAD plus. So you have to notice that every answer looks like every single answer has this in common. Okay, so that's constant. But now what about the other ones? This looks like it's an increase, decrease, or hang on. Maybe I'm not seeing this properly. That's so okay. First one's decrease, second one's increase, then decrease, then increase. So if we can figure out whether this first part is increase or decrease, we can rule out half the answers. Then we're also looking for what's happening to the NAD plus concentration, and then we can use that to then find the final answer. So the key is that you need to pay attention to every part of the answer, because if you compare B and D, for example, you might be right about the first part, but you might be wrong about the second part, and partially wrong on the MCAT is still wrong. So that's what you got to be careful for. Okay. Skim the stems before you read the passage. This one is also really important. There's a lot of debate on like whether you should you read all the questions before the passage, should you read the passage first. I personally subscribe to the idea that you should kind of browse the questions just a little bit before you read the passage, at least the first question, because that's the one you're going to answer right as you finish reading the passage. So often the first question in a passage will be very straightforward and won't require all the information in the passage. So if you're noticing that there are certain aspects of the passage that maybe aren't relevant right away, you don't have to spend a huge amount of time like trying to understand them 100%, because like while you need to do your best to try to understand as much as possible, you are on a time limit. You don't have unlimited time to read like you would a scientific paper, and a lot of these things could come from scientific papers. You need to figure out what's relevant, and skimming the question stems can give you an idea of what you should actually care about. Okay, so this is a problem that I've noticed a lot when I've been tutoring, is that small problems like calculating a density from a mass and a volume, or calculating like a mole ratio or stoichiometry. Smaller problems that you might be really comfortable with can hide in bigger, scarier problems. So, like I said, if you have a complicated series of reactions with different reactants and products and multiple solutions of like salt solutions, aqueous solutions that are floating around and doing things and interacting, you might have your first question might be like, how many moles of so and so solute are in 20 milliliters of one of the solutions? This once you've gotten hit with all this other crap in the passage, this question might seem overwhelming. But if you look at the question, if you look at the question on its own, it's just liters to moles. It requires a single calculation, and it's something you could probably do pretty easily. But the thing that people often do is they negotiate against themselves. They decide that a question is too hard before they even necessarily start it, and then that's like an accidental form of self-sabotage that then they won't get it right because they decided that they won't get it right. Okay, a question from Leslie. I've heard advice. Oh, 1 second. Okay, heard advice about not really reading the passage. So I think that's a better strategy for the ACT than for the MCAT. I think the MCAT you have to lean a little bit more. You have to like there's more writing on you understanding the passage better, like just because the passages are more complicated. So you kind of have to have a foot in both the passage and the questions. So I do think that as far as what you're asking about tables and figures, I do think that that can be helpful at like kind of getting your bearings, but they often explain why or how those figures are put together in the text of the passage. And so it's harder to gauge that out of context and actually interpret it, especially because if you see a graph, you might make an assumption and answer a question over a certain way, but then there's this one paragraph, a couple of lines below it, that clarifies a point that then changes your answer to that question. So you kind of have to find a balance, and that you can only find once you do a lot of practice. You'll see like how much time do I really need to spend reading the passage before answering the first question, and how much time should I spend with the questions before like trying to dive headfirst into the passage. So that's something that you kind of have to figure out yourself as far as what works and what increases your accuracy the most, because everyone's processing is going to be a little bit different. So I would say try a couple different things based on your practice and see what makes sense and what works best for you. Okay. Units. Okay, so this is a big one that lots of people overlook. So when you're answering problems, especially computational ones, you have to remember what units you want, not just what. So there's two aspects to it. One is what type of answer do you want? Do you want energy, power, length, mass, weight, work? And then you have to figure out what the units are. Like, are all the units in joules in the answers, but all they give you is kilograms and meters, or grams and centimeters? You have to notice not only what units are provided in the passage, but also what units are in the answers, and make sure that you're not missing a conversion halfway through that will change your answer. That's actually a really, really common mistake. Every number comes with a unit, unless it specifically says that it's unitless or arbitrary units. Every single number has a unit in these types of problems. Okay, the MCAT is all about, especially with the Chem Phys section, the MCAT is all about mental math, because you don't get to use a calculator. And believe it or not, that's actually a blessing, because they can't throw a bunch of like crazy stuff at you with super complicated computations, because they know that you are limited by not having a calculator. And so they have to make it easy for you. Things, if you're dividing and multiplying things will be in multiples of 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5. Gravity you can always estimate as 10, things like that. Like they will make it easy for you to if you know how to solve the problem, to figure out what the actual numerical answer is. So let's look at this example. How many moles of Cl minus are there in a 4.92 liters of a 0.098 molar solution of potassium chloride? So with estimation, what you should immediately be thinking is, this is 5 liters. This is 0.1 molar. And so you take 5 liters as 0.5 moles. So in effect, there's some degree of saying that's 5-ish, that's 0.1-ish, and then figuring out where you're going to land. So if the answers are like 0.038 or 0.048 or 0.48, 0.61, if your answers are like, I'm gonna put them up here, 0.48, 0.61, 0.91, we know that we overestimated this and we overestimated this. So 0.48, I don't know if this is actually the right answer, but 0.48 is going to be a reasonable answer because it's just below 0.5, which is what we estimated. Okay. Now there's also an element of the common sense test. So when you're doing these types of problems, you need to give yourself, you need to kind of sometimes take a step back and think, like, is this computation necessary? Because not all computations that will get you to the answer are necessary. And so this is an example of what that means. So I want you to try answering this question without lifting a finger. No writing, no calculator. What do y'all think the answer is? So it should say mass of 4 micrograms, volume of 5 cubic millimeters. All right, we got one person saying A. Okay. Okay, we got 30 people here. I'm sure that more than 2 of you have figured this out. All right. So those of you who said A are correct. So as Michaela's pointed out in the chat, so it's actually you could convert, like, if you really had the time, you could convert this to 4 times 10 to the negative 6 or 4 10 to the negative 8th, and you could and you could convert this to 5 times 10 to the whatever. But the point is that all you really need is the 4 and the 5. The rest is just powers of 10. So 4 divided by 5 equals 0.8. And the rest is just details. So you can automatically, because the answers are so different, you can automatically come to that conclusion. All right. it says example twice. Okay, so so mental math for scientific notation. So scientific notation is going to be super important for this section especially. You should be very comfortable with manipulating numbers and scientific notation. You should be able to go from milligrams to grams, grams to kilograms, centimeters to meters, newtons to kilonewtons, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is an example where you'd actually have to do that, where now you got all these answers that have 8 in them, and therefore you're not really going to know, excuse me, you're not really going to know which answer is which unless you actually do the math. Okay. Some recommendations on equations, laws, constants. So I just have a couple that I thought of here. It's not, this is just a few of them. I would say use the Kaplan quick sheets as a resource for knowing what is going to be relevant. So as far as, like, for example, gas laws, you should know all of these gas laws. Not all of them are as well known, but knowing them is really helpful. Especially for the ideal gas law, you should know what the assumptions of the ideal gas law are and under what conditions the ideal gas law fails and needs corrections. Constants, Planck, elementary charge, Avogadro's constant, things like that. Also pretty helpful. But yeah, I would say defer to the Kaplan quick sheets. They've pretty much got everything you need. I also have a list on a later slide that shows a lot of equations that you will need, and you'll have access to this, obviously. Okay. Unit conversions. So you should be able to understand units expressed as other units. So especially when you have to like do computations, when you're calculating like force given mass and distance, or mass and gravity, et cetera, et cetera. So a Newton is a kilogram meter per second squared. Volt is a joule per coulomb. Farad is a coulomb per volt. Joule is a Newton meter, or a kilogram meter squared per second squared. So those types of things are things you should know. You should know that a watt is a joule per second, for example. So you get the idea. So, and knowing the difference between work, energy, and power. Work and energy are very similar. They have the same units. Power is work or energy divided by time. Voltage, current, and resistance, potential and kinetic energy. Also, one big one is doing conversions between moles, particles, liters, and grams. You should be very comfortable going from like liters to moles to using the mole ratio and then going to grams. Like, you should be pretty comfortable with doing those types of problems because they'll expect you to do them, and they'll expect you to do them efficiently. And so having practice with that is going to be really important. Okay, equations. This is just a giant list of equations. I'm not going to stay too long on this slide because you'll have access to it later. This is not an exhaustive list. What I found to be super helpful is whenever I'm doing practice problems and I find an equation or a version of an equation that maybe isn't super obvious that I haven't learned, usually with UWorld or with AAMC, I will write it down and add it to my equation sheet, and then I'll memorize it, and then it might come in handy later as kind of a shortcut version of one of these formulas that's the more obvious ones that are used. So use your practice to add to your toolkit. Okay. Things to have in your back pocket. This is just a list that I came up with. It's not exhaustive, obviously, but it's some things that I've encountered before. Free body diagrams. We did a presentation on this, which is linked right here. It's with an emphasis on how to do calculations with objects on a ramp. I'm sure you all, if anybody who's taken physics, you will have encountered objects sliding or sitting on a ramp and having to do like the slanted reference frame with the coordinate axes. Also, lab techniques, we did one on that too, with the link shown below that. One big thing is the unit circle. You should know the sines, cosine, and tangents of major angles very well. You should know that sine 30 and cosine 60 are 1/2. You should know that sine 90 is 1, sine 0 is 0, cosine 0 is 1, tangent to 45 is 1, et cetera, et cetera. You should know all of that stuff pretty well, because that can be really handy with kinematics equations, with force and free body diagrams, doing math for constrained objects. You get the idea. Phase diagrams, you don't have to go super into this, but you should know how they work and how to interpret one, because they sometimes pop up, and going in knowing how those phase diagrams operate can be super helpful. Doppler effect, you should know the different formulas for that, and how and how that, like, what the basic principle of it is. Another big one is equilibrium concept. So you should know how Le Chatelier's law, or Le Chatelier's principle exists, or how the principle works, the common ion effect, percent ionization of an acid or salt, and how to make a buffer solution. So um, given a bunch of different weak acids, and you can pick the one that will give the so, like, if you're given a common problem is, it says which of these weak acids with their conjugate bases would be useful for making a buffer of pH 5, and then it gives you a bunch of acids and their pKa's, and you want to pick the one whose pKa is closest to 5. So things like that, knowing how Ka, Kb, and Ksp work, and being pretty familiar with how to, like, conceptually what they mean and how to do computations with them, super important. Question from Brian: are major angles 0, 35, 40, 60, 90 enough? Yes, because those are the ones you'll most encounter, and if you have an angle that's larger than that, you can use those angles, and just flip, and you can use the corresponding angle and just flip the sign. So, like, sine of 120 is the same as sine of 60. Cosine of 120 is negative cosine of 60. So you can just use that. And then one random thing that I've kind of noticed is that it's a really easy mistake to make. If you have a 0.2 molar solution of iron 3 chloride, that means you have 0.2 molar of iron 3 plus and 0.6 molar of Cl minus, because every formula unit of FeCl3 dissociates to form 1 Fe3 plus ion and 3 Cl minus ions. And so you might be asked, like, what's the concentration of chloride in a 0.2 molar solution of FeCl3? The answer is 0.6, because there's 3 of them, not 0.2. And that's a mistake I've seen actually quite a lot. It's really easy to make, and so just be wary of that. Okay. Okay, so so this session was pretty short because, to be honest, when I was thinking about strategies to address a lot of what I addressed in last session, the biochemistry biology section, and the general MCAT strategy session are the same as what I would talk about for this section. So I would encourage any of you who weren't there or haven't seen those sessions to go back and watch the recordings, and send us an email if you need access to those. It's a lot of things. A lot of advice is going to be similar across the science sections. So I'm going to suggest that you send us an email at, I'm going to put the email right here. Send us an email here if you have questions about that, or if you want access to that. So now I'm going to open it up to any questions you have about this section. You can also ask about other parts of other aspects of the exam, or other sections. But this is a time especially to ask about this particular section. So you can ask in the chat, you can unmute yourself, whatever you'd like.
I have a question on how to use the how to review the TPR practice exam following. I noticed the
Princeton review.
double A, I noticed double ANC is much more easier and much more straightforward than the
Yeah.
TPR. But
Yeah. So yeah, go ahead, continue.
when I after I finished taking the Princeton review, I got a lot of the question wrong, which would taking even more time to review them. So, and I was not sure if I should slow down taking the practice exam and more focus on the content knowledge, or I should just keep doing this on top of.
It's hard to say without specifics, but I would say that like the Kaplan and Princeton review, like I mentioned this before in a couple other sessions, that they have a vested interest in making you feel stupid because then you'll buy more of their crap. And so that's why the Princeton review and Kaplan both jack up the difficulty and the depth of their practice exams. So I would say be careful with how you judge yourself based on those exams. What I usually recommend is um, if you need extra practice exams for just the practice of getting used to a 7-hour exam for the stamina aspect of it and keeping focused, I think those exams can be helpful. But as far as using as a benchmark for your overall progress and readiness, I'm a little more skeptical of those. That's why I say like kind of space out the AAMC practice exams like throughout your overall process so you can get periodic updates on how you're doing, and then also to lean on the question banks that the AAMC offers to figure out how you're doing as far as your topic knowledge.
I seem to be doing pretty close to my target score on the double ANC, but when I doing the TPR test, that will take a lot of the time to review my mistake, and
Yeah,
which I
that's probably
just
because of that overinflation of difficulty. That's my guess. So I
how
mean,
should
so I would
how should
say like you can always review that stuff, but just take it with a grain of salt.
okay, and there will be the same thing like a type of Excel sheet of like where you made the mistake and like
Yeah,
a
yeah. Just
condition.
don't get super um like invested in your Kaplan performance, especially if your AAMC or TPR performance, but especially if your AAMC performance is good. Like even if your Kaplan or TPR performance is bad, like if your AAMC performance is good, then you're probably doing fine.
Okay, I see. Thank you so much.
Hmm.
I had a question. So
Yeah, could you speak
I
up, please?
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So I recently took a practice exam with the double AMC and I scored okay,
Okay.
but I'm having issues with, I guess, getting the content down to where I can go into practice problems confidently. So I was originally just starting with practice questions and trying to get through it. And then I was, doing that. And I went and took the exam and I was having trouble. It took me longer to review the test than what I thought. And I'm trying to maximize my time to where I'm not where I'm not doing content for so long. So that way it's not taking away from me doing practice problems. So my question is when you were studying, or what advice would you give someone who's trying to maximize their time for this section specifically and any other section so we can start working on practice problems and doing well on other practice exams prior to taking our exam?
Sure. So, when is your exam?
So it's scheduled for April 23rd, but I'm thinking about postponing it until May.
Okay. Okay. Well, first of all, you, especially if you could use more time, I would recommend postponing it until May, just because you're not going to gain anything by taking it in April versus May. Um, but you will gain more time if you take it in May. So, like, I would say like mid-May is usually when I think is the latest you can take it, but like if you take it by mid-May, you're going to be fine as far as like apps and stuff. Um, so as far as preparation, I would say it kind of depends on where you're starting. So like there is a like depending on what how strong you are with this particular section, there becomes a critical mass of content that you reach, that you gain more from practice problems that then kind of help you notice more concepts to review. And so I would say one thing that I found really helpful was going through, like, for example, the Khan Academy playlists on like this entire like Chem Phys section, for example, and just go through the overall section headings, and then see if there's something that's like, wow, I don't feel like I know very much about that. Like, I don't feel like I know about this. Like, this seems unfamiliar. So hit those, and like watch the videos and go over that content. Then kind of give a kind of a second pass and think about like, okay, what do you feel semi-confident about? And in parallel to doing that, continue with practice questions, and you use every single practice question every single practice question is either going to be something you know or something you're about to learn. And that's the mindset you should be going into it with. Every single question is something you either know already or are about to learn. And so if you use those practice questions to figure out where all the gaps in your knowledge are, you can eventually start sealing up those gaps by doing targeted practice. And then hopefully by the exam, you will have covered up enough of those holes and gotten enough practice with the overall feel for the exam that then you will you'll be successful.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, question from Cynthia in the chat. I have the AMC bundle in UWorld and I tried doing their questions, but they're really difficult for me right now. I haven't been able to study much. However, I know that practice makes perfect for just content review. Okay, so this is I'm reading your question back to you. Okay, so it's good that you're thinking about this early. So I would say that sometimes it's one of those situations where, to quote Tony Stark, you have to run before you can walk a little bit. So you can start doing practice questions and use them not to gauge yourself, but use them as a kind of like I don't know, figuring out where all your weaknesses are. So you get an optics question, you bomb it. Okay, let's go over lenses. You get an equilibrium question wrong, and you like don't know the entire passage. That's something you can go over. So if you don't have time for bulk studying, or if you're having trouble figuring out a direction, because especially with UWorld, because you have so many questions, you can start doing a little bit of practice and use that as your guide to content review. And so that way you kind of have to have this hybrid approach where you're either learning or relearning content in parallel to your practice. And as you practice, you're getting more and more comfortable with the format as you use those questions to then fuel your content review. And eventually you'll be able to use those practice questions as practice more than just figuring out where your issues are. And also the fact that you have, 3 months, a little more than 3 months, means that you can do this. You have time to do this effectively. All right. Any other questions?
Do you think it's necessary to highlight questions for the Chem Phys section, or is that wasting time? And then how would you approach reading graphs, or if you're not really comfortable with research or stuff like that?
Okay, so your first question was I'm not sure I understood your first question.
Do you think it's a waste of time as far as highlighting the passage before reading questions, or would you recommend just kind of highlighting based on what the questions are asking?
So I usually like to give it a skim, and I'm like, okay, just kind of highlight. Like, what is the basic thing? If I had like, I don't know, 30 to 60 seconds to read this passage and be like, what's the gist of this? That's kind of what I highlight. And so I kind of go through and highlight a few things. Maybe I would have taken a glance at the first 1 or 2 questions before that, just to get an idea of what kind of things I'd be asking about. I don't think highlighting is a waste of time. I think that taking notes might be a little bit of a waste of time, or making a diagram. I mean, it's hard to make absolute statements. Sometimes that's helpful, but it's a lot of the times highlighting is preferable because it's faster, and it gives you a chance to like kind of focus on certain things, slow down a little bit to pick out key parts of the passage. As far as graphs, so having a research background myself, I do feel like I have an advantage, and I had an advantage when I was taking the MCAT, because I was used to like how articles and papers and experiments tended to structure themselves. And I think it can be difficult if you don't have research experience. That being said, I do think that there's a couple of different ways to improve. The most obvious one is just to do it a lot and get comfortable with how that works. And it's going to suck at first, but it does get better. Another thing I would say is there are actually some solid, like, dedicated guides online for free, that are meant to help, that are pretty detailed and meant to help with like getting used to the format of research papers and in passages for the MCAT. And then the last thing I would say is to find someone to guide you with that particular thing and help you with a few of those so you get comfortable with it. Like, for example, like I do one-on-one tutoring, both kind of as a freelance and as a volunteer. And so that's something that I help people with. And that can make a huge difference too. So I would say those 3 avenues are things that that I'd recommend looking at.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so exam is May 15th. Scoring very low. Okay, so I would say that so you're operating with what, 7 weeks, something like that. It depends on where it depends on, I guess, what you're. I would have some like further questions before saying like what exactly you should do. But I mean, my overall thoughts are that there's no like, I'm not going to say either like you have to reschedule it because maybe you can improve. I'm not going to say you should just go ahead and take it because maybe you need more time. It really depends on where the differential is between your current score and your target score, and whether you feel that you benefit from more time. Because the worst thing to happen is you end up in a box where you don't have enough time, and you're kind of going in expecting to fail or expecting to do poorly, and then either because you're unprepared or because you have low expectations of yourself, or both, you don't do as well, and then you have to try to apply with that score, and it's just going to be it's going to suck for you. Not only because maybe you can't necessarily get into where you want, but because you're not going to feel like you put your best foot forward. And so that kind of sounds like very, very gloomy and whatnot. But I would say think about what you want, and if going and taking it on that day is going to be a detriment to that, and only you'll really be able to know that and tell that for yourself, then be open to pushing it back, giving yourself more time, because in all honesty, if like the worst case scenario for a lot of people studying for the MCAT is they have to retake it and then delay their application. That can be a pain in the ass, but if it gives you, if that is what will help you get the score you want to get into the school that you want, 1 year is honestly not going to kill you. And that's the worst case scenario. Like maybe there's other things that you can like, maybe there's other alternatives, other ways forward. But worst case scenario, if you have to delay applying a whole year, you're still gonna be fine. You might even be better. That's my take on it. Given the information that based on the information in your question. That being said, you're welcome to reach out to us at that email that I put in the chat above. We are happy to help with if you want to give us some more information about your situation, and we're happy to help and give you some advice. Another question: which books and guides did you prefer to begin studying for the MCAT? Okay, so I have some strong opinions about it. So let's see. Okay, number one, the AAMC online bundle. I'm gonna write the email on this slide. Okay, so AAMC online only bundle is the best by far because it's right from the source. It has 4 practice exams, a bunch of question packs, a sample test. By the way, the sample test is the thing you should do first, no matter what. If you haven't taken the sample test, take the sample test as the next thing you do. Sample test will tell you where you are, where you can improve. It'll give you some questions to then start going off of when you start planning your review, all that. So that's the first thing I would, and then lastly I would say, then second I would say is UWorld. UWorld pretty much got me helped me get the score that I wanted. It was one of the most important things. It 2,000 practice questions, very, very close to what the AAMC is expecting, with a couple of exceptions. The CARS is not the greatest, but almost like I would say anything that could possibly happen on the MCAT is somewhere in that UWorld question bank. And so if you do all the questions, you will encounter it, and then you will get a chance to learn it or solidify it. Pretty much everything after that. Yeah, and UWorld has fantastic explanations. They have diagrams, they have tables, they have groupings of concepts. So like, for example, like if there's a question on ego defense mechanisms, it'll give you a table of all the ego defense mechanisms and the definitions of each one. If you go through like Erickson's stages, it'll give you every single one. It's fantastic. Best, like as far as money spent, yeah, it is. The value is fantastic. And then after AAMC, after UWorld is pretty much everybody else, which is Princeton Review, Kaplan, Exam Crackers, Next Step, all the other ones, Blueprint, whatever. Okay. Okay. Question from Brian. I would say don't take practice exams weekly. Like that's the thing that I see a lot of people doing, but like think about that you're taking a practice exam every single week. Like that's a lot. I would say practice exams every other week, so you get a rest week, like where you're just doing regular review, because that it really takes it out of you, and you don't want to be, especially like I see people in like the month before the exam, they're taking an exam every week. You're just going to crash when you hit the actual MCAT.
And so this is not just for saving the real double ANC online practice exam, but also as a third, like do every other week for the third party exam as well.
Yeah. So I would say so have you already taken 2 AAMC full lengths?
Yes.
Okay. So I mean, I would say space them out. And then like I said before, like the only reason, like, so Princeton Review, other third-party full-length exams are most helpful when you're using them to gain stamina, and least helpful for understanding how much you actually know, because they tend to go way too deep. So I would say you can do those, but just realize that you're probably going to do worse, and that doesn't mean that you've gotten worse or are not ready. Just keep that in mind. Not knowing when you're going to take the exam is hard. But you kind of have to, like, there's no real easy answer for that. As far as if you don't know when you're going to take it, how to plan, you just kind of have to keep practicing at a low level until you know when you're going to take it. And then when you find out when you're going to take it, then you can start ramping it up and really.
And then in that case, what should I do with my remaining 4 lanes? Double ends.
Well, as far as when you're going to take it, is it going to be in a month? Is it going to be in 6 months? Is it going to be in 2 weeks? Like,
I want to try to take it in within 1.5 months.
1.5 months, then do like one AAMC in 2 weeks, one in 4 weeks, and you should be good. Like, something like that. Like, space it out, give yourself enough time in between, so you can get a good kind of linear track of where your progress is. Because if you take them both too early, then you're gonna have a bunch of weeks where you're not sure where you're at. If you take them too late, you might realize too late that you need to fix some things. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you so much.
Okay, what I recommend for cars. Okay, so cars is kind of first of all, I hate cars. It's the worst. At least I think so. It's just this mind game that lasts an hour and a half. That being said, I would say I recommend Jack Weston is pretty good for daily cars practice. Some of those passages are a little hit or miss, but it's good overall, like kind of regular like practice to get in the habit. I think there's some good AAMC cars. It's kind of hard to find good third-party cars. UWorld cars, I didn't do a ton of that. UWorld cars, I think, is fine, but not as good as UWorld's other stuff. So, yeah, cars is a tough one. Would you recommend taking notes on UWorld, all the questions you don't get, or is that time? Okay, every single question I don't get gets a couple of minutes of study, or more than that, depending on why I got it wrong. And especially like if you're asked a concept question or something like that references like it references like 4 concepts, the answer is A, B, C, D, 4 different concepts, and let's say you know the answer is A, but you haven't heard of C or D, go look up C and D and add them to your flashcards. So that way you're kind of scooping up as much information and content that is relevant as you can, because UWorld rarely includes a bunch of other crap that you don't need. It's almost everything on it is fair game for the MCAT. So I think there is a value in going over every question you get wrong in UWorld, every question you get wrong in your practice exams, because that is giving you information on what you need to work on. If it's not content, it's strategy. It's what type of dumb mistakes you make. Everyone makes dumb mistakes, but not everyone makes the same dumb mistakes. And so figuring that out can help you too. Is the act of copying down info, do you mean like the information in the explanations? I mean, if you don't know something, going over it, I feel like should include copying them down or taking some notes, or just making a little note saying, hey, remember this. It doesn't have to be anything complicated if it's something you knew but just messed up on. Okay. All right. Other questions? Okay. I'm going to assume that since I'm seeing and hearing none, that you don't have any further questions. That being said, if you have questions that come up later that you think of, you're welcome to reach out to us at mcat101questions@gmail.com. You'll also be getting a post-session email, which will have the link to this, probably the link to the slides as well. UWorld does not have full-length exams, no. So yeah, I hope this was helpful. Stay tuned for any future sessions we have on probably other sections or various other topics related to the MCAT. yeah, so feel free to reach out to us, and hope to see you guys at the next session.